So I wanted to start talking about some things that maybe the church teaches wrong. And this for me is maybe like number 1 or 2 on that list. It's extremely high up there because for me in my life, this was the number 1 thing that I think the church really, it made things harder instead of easier in my life. It made things more difficult in a lot of ways in my relationship and in my marriage. And so let's talk about sex before marriage. Let's talk about sex in general.
Sex, baby, let's talk about you and me.
Now, a lot of you have very, very strong opinions about this whole subject, and I promise you I'm not going to be teaching you anything majorly new, but I do want to have more of a biblical perspective of about exactly what the Bible says about this subject, and to walk in how the church teaches this, and maybe how we could teach it in a better way, in a more useful way. So throughout all of my time in church, I've been told sex bad, right? Now that's a very simplified version. Obviously there was caveats to that in terms of marriage and what that looked like, but from a young person's point of view, ever since I was a little kid in church, this is the message that drove into my brain over and over and over again, was that sex is bad. Sex is a sin. Sex is not good. You should feel guilty for having sex. All that kind of stuff was really drilled into my brain. Now, throughout my life, I actually never had sex with anybody until I was married. And so this wasn't really an issue with me other than, other bases maybe that I crossed or different things, but I never got to that point of actually sleeping with anybody. And so for me, I always held this firm line of, I will never go there. I'm not going to do that. This is a bad thing in a lot of ways. And that's what I felt the church was teaching me overall. So let's take a second and look at what the Bible actually says about this. If you look into the Bible and try to find a place where it says, do not have sex before marriage, you're not going to find it. It's actually not in the Bible. However, I do think that this is what the Bible shows us. So let's look at a couple of verses that kind of show us where we get this whole idea from in the first place. Okay, first is going to be 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Principles for marriage. Of course, this is Paul writing here to the Corinthians in Corinth, and we're going to start here in verse 2. But because of the temptation of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. So this is a really clear verse that shows us, hey, there's a lot of temptation when it comes to extramarital things or premarital things. There's a lot of temptation that comes with that because you're not bound to the one person that you should be with. So maybe don't do that, right? Make sure that you have one husband, make sure that you have one wife, and make sure that you are having sexual relations in that marriage itself. Another one, again, we don't know the author of Hebrews, but this is Hebrews chapter 13. And here's what they have to say here. So we're going to start in verse 4 here. Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. And so here we're seeing, if we gather these two verses together, right, we see as Paul talks about, hey, sexual immorality is abounding in those that don't have one husband and one wife. Make sure that you're not falling into that world where, you're dealing with all of these sexual immoral things. And then we see this one also, let marriage be held in honor, and don't let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. So it's giving us kind of two juxtaposing things here. On the one hand, we have marriage and how sex in marriage is great. Then we have, on the other hand, sexual immorality and adultery. So these things are outside of marriage, and inside of marriage, it's a safe spot. Now, let's think about this logically, okay? I think this is something that really never got through to me as a church kid, and I'm not 100% sure why that is, but I do think it's dangerous how some churches begin to teach about this, okay? Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying this video and you want to see more content just like this, then it would really help us out if you would support us on Patreon. For as little as $5 a month, you could help to make sure that we can continue to make content on this channel just like this, biblical content that's diving deep into what we actually need to know. So If you want to do that, hit the link in the description down below and become part of our Patreon family. All right, let's get back to the video. So for me, right, again, I had this very hard line. I was not going to sleep with anybody before I got married, right? But I didn't exactly know why that was. I just was told that that was the case, right? So let's talk about this from a biblical point of view. We see these two verses that really point to us, hey, this is a really bad thing. And logically, let's think through this. Marriage, right? You have one person that you're with for the rest of your life. You spend that time with them and you're able to form a bond with them that is stronger than anything else. Now, if you have sex or do other things outside of this, it can become a really, really big issue. Now, let's say that you're not married, you're single and you're sleeping around with whoever you want. Well, there's a lot of things that are a problem with this. Number one, your soul is like, it's spread to everybody. When you sleep with someone, it's not just a physical action. It is also an emotional, it is also a spiritual action. This is something that connects you with that person forever. Forever. And some part of you is going to be left with that person, no matter how big, no matter how small, it will be left with that person forever. Then on top of that, think about the nastiness that could come along with being with so many people, right? You have all of these different diseases and different things that are transmitted through this act. So it can become extremely, extremely dangerous, not just for you, but anyone that you've been in contact with. This causes a huge issue, right? And it can cause many more cascading down into all the other people that they've been with, et cetera, et cetera. It's really bad. It can get really, really bad. So just from a logical standpoint, this makes sense that you should be with one person. Now, again, in the world today, nobody is really going to understand this. In the world today, nobody's really going to have a full grasp on this. But biblically, I think it's very clear that it shows us, it's teaching us, hey, you should be in your marriage having one husband or one wife, and that's how this should be done. Now, if we put this into two different categories and we're talking about marriage and we're talking about outside of marriage and sexual immorality and adultery, then this gives us clear understanding that there are verses that talk about sexual immorality that now apply to premarital sex, if that makes sense. So we can go to a verse like, for example, Acts 15, verse 20, that says, but should write them, so I'll start in 19 so it makes more sense to you. Therefore, my judgment is that we should not trouble those of Gentiles who turn to God, but should write them to abstain from the things polluted by idols and from sexual immorality and from what has been strangled and from blood. So it's telling them these are the things that you should avoid. Sexual immorality is part of that list because they're showing sexual immorality not only as promiscuity, not only as same-sex attraction, things like that, but it also outside of marriage period, having these different relations and doing these different things. So that's what it's saying there. If we also go to 1 Corinthians chapter 5 right here, we see another verse that would apply to it as well. It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you and of a kind that is not tolerated even among the pagans, for a man has his father's wife. This chapter is one of the wildest chapters in all of the Bible. But this gives us a clear view of how Paul thought about sexual immorality in general. So he's saying there's sexual immorality among you. That's number one. Number two, he's saying that it is worse than even the pagans would tolerate, right? So he's saying we don't tolerate sexual immorality. This shouldn't be happening. But number two, this type of sexual immorality is even worse than the pagans because someone is sleeping with his father's wife, right? Which we believe is a stepmom. It could possibly be his real mom, but we don't actually know. As I go back to think about how the church taught me this, I came to the feeling of sex bad, right? Instead of sex is amazing in the right context and in marriage. And I don't think it's that the people that I was listening to growing up didn't try to teach me that. It's just what I was shown over time. I saw so many different people that were just had such struggles with this and really had a hard time adhering to what the biblical understanding was. And the outcomes of those things really made it seem like sex bad. And that's the conclusion that I came to. And so for me, even when I got married, it was a real struggle for me. Even when I got married, I mean, I remember the first few months, maybe 6 months to a year of our marriage, I would feel guilty having sex with my wife, right? Which is such a strange thing to think about and such a strange concept that I don't think a lot of people understand. But for church kids that are in church, you have to understand that this is a huge, huge struggle. I think primarily for women, because I think that it's way harder for a man to go through puberty and through high school and college without sleeping with anybody. Primarily for women, I think this is a major thing. Girls that grow up in youth group, that grow up in church, and then they go on to college and then they get married. I think this is pretty common where these girls will have really a huge amount of guilt when it comes to sex, even in marriage. And for me, it was definitely a huge battle that I had to go through. I had to reteach myself, like, no, this is a great thing, and learn about how this is used in marriage and how it makes me closer to my wife. And I think a lot of people struggle with, and I think a lot of churches struggle with teaching it as well, because they think it's awkward or they think it's a hard thing to talk about. And maybe it is. Maybe it is a hard thing to talk about. Maybe it is a bit awkward. But I think it's extremely important, because this is a huge part of marriage. It really, really is. It's a huge part of how we connect with our partner, and how we love them, and how we show them that we are connected to them. And if you don't have a healthy life in that sense, I think it can be really destructive to your marriage. I just wanted to share my thoughts on this. I think this is something that we struggle with a lot, and I'd love to hear about it and start some conversations in the comments down below.